Let's talk about running backs that you should start, or more importantly, sit heading into week 9 of the fantasy football season. It's important to note that we've got the Steelers and the 49ers on bye, so you won't have important names like Najee Harris, Jordan Mason, or Jaylen Warren. But I'm going to talk through all 30 teams that are in play this week, 15 matchups in total, starting with Thursday Night Football. We've got an actual really interesting game on 2 weeks in a row here. Texans at the New York Jets. The Jets have got to turn this thing around. They're currently 2-6, and if they're not already at the bottom of this pit of despair, another loss could really put them there. 42.5 point over under, and the Texans are favored by 1.5 points, even though they are the away team. And the way I see this matchup for running backs and fantasy is it's very simple. Of course, you're going to start Joe Mixon, my RB6 on the week. And of course, you're going to start Breece Hall, who through 8 weeks rather, is the RB7 in fantasy football. Joe Mixon, guys, by the way, he has played in 5 games. In 4 of those games, he was fully healthy. And in the 4 games where he's been fully healthy, he's averaging almost 26 PPR points per game. The dude is an absolute monster. He's had 3 games out of his 4 healthy games with 25 or more carries. He's gotten over 100 yards on the ground in all 4 of his games where he's been healthy, and he's getting targets in the air on a good offense. I mean, the guy is an absolute monster. As far as Breece Hall goes, look, when they made the change to offensive coordinator in week 6, we saw Breece Hall just be the complete dominant back in this backfield where Braylon Allen kind of just completely shrunk. Now in week 8, we started to see a little bit more of a split backfield. This will be something to watch over the course of time. In week 8, Breece had 19 touches compared to 12 for Braylon Allen. But again, since that change happened at offensive coordinator, you can see Breece is averaging over 21 touches per game, while Braylon's more around the 6 mark. Now, technically, if you look at the last 4 weeks, these are 2 defenses that are actually quite difficult for your fantasy running back. In the last 4 weeks, the Texans are 29th in points allowed, and the Jets are 22nd in points allowed. So these are 2 defenses that are tough, but 2 superstar quarterbacks that you've got to play. And by the way, guys, when you look at the points allowed, that's going to be from the last 4 weeks for every matchup that we talk about. All right, moving on to the Cowboys at the Falcons. This is the start of the 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time slate of games, a 48.5 point over-under, which is tied for the highest over-under of the week. So we could see a ton of fantasy points in this one. The Falcons are favored at home by 1.5 points. So it's a very close game. It could really go either way. But of course, the Falcons at home are going to get that favored tag. Now, as far as Bijan Robinson goes, absolute must start. He is really starting to find his groove, not only in fantasy football, but also in the way that they're utilizing him for the Atlanta Falcons. He's had now 3 games in a row with over 23 PPR points, the RB5 on the season. And while Tyler Algier is getting consistent touches, he's just not someone that you can start unless you have a game script like Carolina, where you know this team is just going to dominate them and they can run on the ground, run that team into submission. And earlier in the season, the Cowboys were a really good matchup for your fantasy running back. But if you look at the last 4 weeks, they're actually 25th in points allowed, so they're not giving up many points. That's the 7th worst matchup for your running back. So I only think Bijan's in play for this one. As far as Rico Dowdle go, look, I mean, he's like an eternal spot start. You can totally play him, but just lower your expectations, right? I think 10 points is a realistic outcome for a Rico Dowdle, and if that is your best option, then put him out there. He's on a high-powered offense. This is a high over-under. You can totally put him in there in deeper formats. All right, Broncos at Ravens, 44.5 point over under, and the Ravens are favored by 8.5 points. Honestly, I feel like this is a little bit disrespectful towards Denver. I mean, Denver's showed to be a pretty decent team. This is tied for the 2nd largest spread of the week. So the Denver Broncos are the 2nd biggest underdogs in this game this week. Now, let's talk about Derrick Henry. Of course, you got to play Derrick Henry. He's my RB2 on the week, the RB1 overall so far this year. Is scoring the 3rd most points in fantasy football, point blank period. He is averaging over a touchdown per game. Of course, you're going to play the king himself. On the opposite side, actually, in the last 4 weeks, the Ravens have been a pretty good matchup for your fantasy running back, giving up the 8th most points to the position. So I do think Javonte Williams is a spot start name, but the reality is this backfield, man, snip, snap, figure it out, Sean Payton. Every week it's something different, right? I mean, Jaleel McLaughlin gets more involved last week in a good matchup versus the Panthers. Jaleel McLaughlin gets a receiving touchdown. I mean, we had Sutton shut out a couple weeks ago. Now he's a superstar last week. I mean, it's this entire offense is up and down. You want Troy Franklin to break out, and then you don't use him at all. It's just, I don't know. But what I'm telling you is that the Broncos are going to be down probably in this game, and Javonte is a decent pass catcher, so he is in play. All right, moving on to the Dolphins at the Bills. 47.5 point over-under. This is tied with 3 matchups for the second highest over-under of the week, so a lot of fantasy points expected here. The Bills are favored by 6.5 points, almost a full touchdown that the Bills are favored, and I see a lot of fantasy points from running backs in this one, all right? James Cook, coming off an incredible game where he had 2 touchdowns, over 28 fantasy points, the RB8 on the season. And then Devon Achane, a guy that we have been begging you to go out and buy in fantasy football, because when Tua came back, we just felt like he was going to be one of those league-winning players. My RB5 this week. Last week, he had 8 targets, 26.7 PPR points, caught the receiving touchdown. Both of these guys have got to be played. It's a great matchup for both sides. Bills are giving up the 4th most points in the last 4, and the Dolphins are a top 10 fringe matchup as well. Now, Raheem Mostert, it was good to see him get a little bit of a bigger role this week. Now, obviously, if you're an HN owner, you don't want to see that. But Raheem Mostert had 11 total touches. He had 2 rushing touchdowns, and this is a pretty good matchup. So if you're in a desperate position, I do think Mostert is a playable name. But of course, HN is the upside play. All right, the 5th matchup we'll look at here is the Saints at the Panthers. NFC South showdown, 43.5 point over under, and the Saints are favored by 6.5 points. Don't know if Derek Carr will play in this game or not. That's something we'll have to monitor throughout the week. But Alvin Kamara and Chuba Hubbard, both labeled as must starts for me in my rankings this week. Alvin Kamara is my RB4. Guys, the last time he played the Carolina Panthers was week 1. In week 1, he averaged over 5.5 yards per attempt. He had a touchdown. He had 5 receptions. He had 22 fantasy points. You absolutely have to put Alvin Kamara in your lineup. I don't care if you're in a 6-team format. On the opposite side of the ball, the Saints in the last 4 weeks are giving up the 3rd most points to fantasy running backs. So Chuba Hubbard is definitely in play. Now, look, of course, if Jonathan Brooks comes back at some point, we have to reassess Chuba, and that could be here very soon. It might even be this week. I don't know when Jonathan Brooks is going to come back exactly. But at this point, with no Jonathan Brooks, Chuba Hubbard's a must start for me. And honestly, even if they did start Jonathan Brooks, I think they would slowly get him into the rotation, and I would still play a Chuba Hubbard. All right, moving on to the next matchup. We've got the Raiders at the Bengals, 44.5 point over under, and the Bengals are favored by 8.5 points. That is tied for the 2nd largest spread of the week. The Raiders are big time underdogs in this one. Chase Brown is the only must start in this matchup, in my humble opinion. He has slowly but surely completely taken over that backfield in Cincinnati. Beginning of the year, the snap percentages weren't there. He wasn't getting that many touches, but each and every week he's eaten at that. And in the last 3 weeks, he's led running backs in snap share and in total touches. He had 15 carries in week 7, 12 carries last week, including 4 targets. I definitely think he's in play. Also, because I think game script favors him, I do see the Bengals up in this game, able to establish the rock, and Chase Brown is one that I would bet on in that backfield. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, Madison is a name that we have told you in certain weeks you can play him, and in certain weeks you can't. For example, last week versus Kansas City, he was on our bust list. Don't play him versus a great defense like Kansas City. But before that, the Rams and the Steelers, 2 decent matchups. He had over 15 fantasy points. I think this is another one of those matchups where you can definitely put him in. The Bengals are a middle-of-the-pack defense against running backs, and ultimately he's used in the air, he's used on the ground, he's used on the goal line, so he's a decent spot start. But, you know, again, better than Raheem Mostert, for example, if you're looking at spot starts, but certainly not a guy that you put in your lineup and think, this guy's going to help me win my week, right? All right, the 7th matchup we'll look at is the Chargers at the Browns. 40.5 point over under. This is one of the smaller, over unders of the week. 2.5 point favorites the Chargers are. J.K. Dobbins is a must start. I will say this is not a good matchup for J.K. Dobbins. And in bad matchups, Dobbins has not been good. For example, Pittsburgh in week 3, 8 points. Kansas City in week 4, 9 points. So we have seen when Dobbins has had difficult matchups, he has not come through. So lower your expectations, because in the last 4 weeks, the Browns have been giving up the 4th fewest points to the running back position. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, but for Dobbins, by the way, it's just touches. Like, that's why we're labeling him a must start. He has so many touches in a decent offense that's built around the run game. I think he should be in most lineups. On the opposite side, Nick Chubb is, the snap share is going up, which is great. The opportunities are going up, which again is great, but he has been so inefficient. 2 yards per carry in week 7 in his return, 3.2 yards per carry versus Baltimore in week 8. So the reality is, in bad matchups, I don't think he's that good of a start. And the Chargers in the last 4 weeks are the 2nd worst matchup for your fantasy running back. So I would prefer to look elsewhere. Like we said earlier, Alexander Mattison. I would prefer Mattison in a different matchup this week. All right, moving on to the Commanders at the Giants. NFC East showdown. It's awesome to see my Commanders doing their thing. That Hail Mary play, man, I will never forget that. That was legendary stuff. 43.5 point over under. The Commanders are favored by 3.5 points anytime the Commanders and the Giants play. It's this clashing of heads. Almost never goes the way the people predict it to, right? The way Vegas predicts it to. But I see 2 clear starts here. Brian Robinson, who has been an incredible player in fantasy football. In fact, there's only been 2 games this year where he hasn't scored a touchdown, and he's been very good. They get into the red zone a lot. They get on the goal line a lot, and Brian Robinson has a lot of those opportunities. Definitely think you can play him in a decent matchup versus the Giants. On the opposite side of the ball, Tyrone Tracy is the definition of a must start if he's healthy. All right, Tyrone Tracy's coming off his best ever game as a professional player. He's very clearly taken over that role in New York. He's coming off a game with 23 touches on Monday Night Football, including 145 rushing yards, over 7 yards per clip versus a pretty decent Pittsburgh Steelers defense. He also got into the end zone. I mean, I think Tyrone Tracy is a must start in a matchup where, you know what, the Commanders defense is better than they used to be for sure, but I still think you can beat them on the ground with a guy like Tyrone Tracy, who's just so talented. But we don't know if Tyrone's going to play, because he did leave this game with a concussion-like symptom. So if Tyrone is out, I think Devin Singletary becomes a spot start. Again, when we're thinking about spot starts, with no Tyrone, I'd prefer Devin over names like Nick Chubb and Madison and Raheem Mostert, but I still don't think that puts him in like the must start type of category. Now, as far as Austin Eckler goes, he's a spot start. He's been pretty efficient this year, but he's just not getting enough volume. In fact, he doesn't have a single game this year over 10 rushing attempts. So he kind of is just like this safe 7 to 10 point floor in a PPR format. But again, I think there are better starts out there for most people. All right, moving on to the Patriots at the Titans. 37.5 point over under. This is by far the lowest over under of the week. There's not a single other matchup in week 9 that is projected to have lower than 40 combined points. The Titans are favored by 3 points, which is crazy. Like, quite frankly, without being disrespectful to these two franchises, this might be the most boring game in the NFL this entire year. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming there's no Drake May after he left with a concussion. So it'll probably be Jacoby Brissett. And the Titans are a boring team to watch. I don't know. I think this is going to be boring, but I do see 2 names that you can start. Number 1, Tony Pollard. The Patriots are the 2nd best matchup for your running back over the last 4 weeks in fantasy football. He's obviously the dominant lion's share type of player in this backfield, the RB20 through 8 weeks, including having a bye week, so even better. And then Ramondre Stevenson, man, this team is like, can you just commit to what you want to be offensively, please? Can you figure it out? It's extremely frustrating on a week-to-week basis, right? 2 weeks ago versus Jacksonville, it was like, man, this should be a smash start for Ramondre Stevenson. He has 10 touches. What the hell? I mean, okay. And then in week 8 versus the Jets, it looks like a bad matchup, and they give him the ball 23 times, including 2 rushing touchdowns. This Patriots offense is so frustrating on a week-to basis. But look, I do think you can spot start Ramondre Stevenson. He's a decent play because I anticipate a lot of volume with no Drake May, but also they're probably not going to move the ball very well. And the Titans are actually the 3rd worst matchup in fantasy football over the last 4 weeks. So be very cautious. You can start Ramondre Stevenson, but have low expectations. There's a lot of things going against him in this matchup. All right, moving on to the start of the 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time slate of games. Bears at Cardinals, 44.5 point over under, and the Cardinals are favored by 1.5 points. Don't look now, but the Cardinals are sitting at 500, and Kyler Murray is playing some damn ball. I know he's getting some hate because of the Call of Duty, but I mean, the guy's playing well. Give him some flowers here. All right, DeAndre Swift must start, my RB13 on the week. He's pretty much been the offense for the Chicago Bears over the last, 5 games for them. He's been an absolute dominant player, averaging over 20 points per game since week 4. You got to put him in your lineups. And on the opposite side, James Conner also is a must start for me. 2 defenses that have actually been pretty tough against running backs in the last 4 weeks, but 2 guys who are just like the workhorses in their offenses, right? If there is any success on the ground, it's because these 2 names got a lot of touches and they probably got into the end zone. So 2 guys that, this offense is not very difficult to figure out. The backfield is very clear. It's the opposite of New England, right? It's very, very clear. Okay, moving on. Jags at Eagles, 47.5 point over-under, tied with 3 other matchups for the second highest over-under of the week, meaning there should be a lot of fantasy points in this one. The Eagles are favored by 7 points, a full touchdown. So we could see a scenario where Saquon Barkley gets an extra bit of carries in the second half. Of course, you're going to play him, one of the best running backs in fantasy football, and he's due for a blow-up game. That could be this week. The Jags are a top 10 matchup against running backs in the last 4. And on the opposite side of the ball, I think it's going to get really confusing here soon. If Travis Etienne plays, it's going to get real confusing real quick, y'all, okay? If Etienne's back out there, I know everyone in the fantasy community is going to be annoyed at me saying this, but they're going to use Travis Etienne. Travis Etienne might lead the team in snaps. He might lead the team in touches. Am I telling you that he should? No, I'm just telling you based off what this coaching staff has said consistently over the last 4 or 5 weeks, they want to use Travis Etienne. They still view Etienne as their number 1 running back. So that leads me to believe that when he's healthy, he will still be the most used running back on the team. So things just get really messy if Etienne's out there, right? Both of these guys are in a spot start kind of category. It's not a good matchup. The Eagles are actually, quick math, the 7th worst matchup for your running back in fantasy football right now over the last 4 weeks. So if you own one of these names, you really want Etienne to sit again this week. And if Etienne is ruled out, Bigsby becomes the RB26. I'll move him up a couple spots. I can't move him up too high because it's not a good matchup. And the reality is, if the Jags are down, they might use Dearness Johnson, as annoying as that is to hear. All right, moving on to the Lions at the Packers. 47.5 point over-under. Another high over-under this week. The Lions are favored by 4.5 points. Of course, that line could probably move depending on Jordan Love's status. But on the Lions side of the ball, this is very simple. You start Jahmyr Gibbs. You start David Montgomery, the best running back backfield in fantasy football. Both of those guys are the definition of must start every single week. On the opposite side of the ball, Josh Jacobs definitely in play, but you'll notice I have him ranked as my RB18. So I'm a little bit lower on him this week, even though he was one of my starts of the week last week. That worked out great. He had 2 touchdowns, over 25 points. But this week I have slightly lower expectations. Oddly enough, the Lions are the 6th best matchup for your running back in the last 4 weeks, which is weird to say because they've been one of the worst matchups for most of fantasy football this year. But something's starting to change. I think the Aiden Hutchinson injury is definitely hurting their rush defense. And the reason I have Jacobs a little bit lower is because if Malik Willis is the starting quarterback here, the offense is just not going to be as good. That's just the reality of the situation. But I would still label him a must start. All right, moving on to Rams at Seahawks. Another high over-under, 48.5 points. That's tied for the highest over-under of the week. Should be a close game. NFC West showdown. Seahawks are favored by 1.5 points, so it's really a toss-up at this point. And this matchup's very easy for fantasy. 2 superstars. Kyron Williams, RB4 in fantasy football, but he's already had his bye week, so he's probably even better in a points per game basis. The dude is just, he can't miss. He cannot miss. He's averaging well over 1 touchdown per game. There's not been a single game this year where he hasn't scored a touchdown. He's money. He's the definition of a smash hit in fantasy football this year. On the opposite side, Ken Walker, also a real must play, the RB9 in fantasy football, coming off a bit of a stinker. He had his worst game versus Buffalo, which was 8.5 points. Now, to be fair, he had like a negative 30-yard rush, and that was because there was a snap that was way over Geno Smith's head, and he had to recover it. But Still, it was his worst fantasy week. I think he bounces back. These are two teams that are top 7 in points allowed to the running back position, a high over under. Yeah, these guys are definitely in play. There's no way you're benching either one of those names. All right, moving on to Sunday Night Football, Colts at Vikings, 45.5 point over under, and the Vikings are favored by 6.5 points. All right, Jonathan Taylor comes back from this injury he's been dealing with for 3 weeks, and do they ease him in? No, they give him the lion's share straight away. This is so good to see if you own Jonathan Taylor. I traded for him in the Flock League. It's been awesome. I mean, they didn't work him in. Clearly, they made sure he was fully healthy before they played him, because last week he had 21 touches, over 100 rushing yards on 5 yards per clip, and 18.7 fantasy points, played over 80% of the snaps. He is that dude. He's got to be in your lineup, even though it's a difficult matchup versus the Vikings. You could have said the same thing last week versus the Tennessee Titans, right? And then on the opposite side of the ball, Aaron Jones. Obviously, you're going to start Aaron Jones if he's healthy. He's been great. There's really only been one game this entire year he's had under 10 PPR points. And the Colts are a top 10 matchup for your fantasy running back. So I could see a nice blow-up game for Aaron Jones this week. All right, moving on to the last game of the week, Monday Night Football, Bucs at Chiefs. Man, even as someone who likes the Chiefs, I really think this could have been one of the better games of the week if there wasn't so many injuries to the Tampa Bay Bucs and their offense specifically. But still, Rachaad White and Bucky Irving, they're both must-starts for me this week. And this might sound counterintuitive because the Chiefs are one of the worst matchups for your running back. In fact, over the last 4 weeks, they're the worst matchup for your running back. And in fantasy, when you adjust for schedule, they're the worst matchup for your running back in the entire season. But this entire offense is funneling through the running backs now. It felt like if you watched the Bucs game this week, every time Baker dropped back, it felt like he was dumping the ball off to a running back. Bucky Irving had 7 targets. Rachaad White had 6 targets. Both of these guys had really good fantasy days, both over 15 PPR points. And that is 2 weeks in a row now that they've done that with no Godwin, with no Evans. This offense is funneling through the running backs. And even though it's a bad matchup, I think they're both must starts because they're just going to be the offense for this team. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, Kareem Hunt is like the guy for this offense, right? He's had now 3 games in a row, over 20 touches. He had 22 touches in week 8. He had 24 touches in week 7. And in week 5, he had 28 touches. I mean, the guy is just funneling every touchdown opportunity. He's getting so many rushing attempts. He's not been efficient, but the offense is literally running through him. Now, keep in mind, this is the largest spread of the week. 9.5 points. The Chiefs are favored. Big time underdogs, the Bucs are, but I think that favors Rachaad White and Bucky Irving. You almost want this team to be down, so they're constantly dumping the ball off in PPR formats. But I appreciate y'all for watching the video. Do me a favor, hit that like button to show some love. Subscribe if you like the content. Last thing I'll say is if you don't have a free account on Flock Fantasy yet, go get one for free. When you use our promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, at sign up, get a free account, and you will unlock the trade calculator, the My Team Analyzer, and of course, the expert consensus rankings. Last thing I'll say is if you have a tough start sit question this week, check out the pinned comment. You can ask us a question at any time on our website. I appreciate you for watching. Good luck this week. Let's get some wins as we get closer to the playoffs, and I'll see you soon. Wide receiver video will be out here in a couple of hours, all right? Love, now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.